By the time the first snowstorm hit, the men who mocked his makeshift shelter were huddled in their log cabins, praying their fires would hold. But Daniel Boone's crude tent, fashioned from tarpaulin and scrapwood, kept a warmth that would leave the settlers speechless. Before we dive into the rest of the story, tell us where you're watching from. And if tales of survival in the face of hardship move you, be sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story might just outlast this one. The wind had already begun to bite, cutting through the bones of every man who had crossed the barren, wind-whipped plains in search of fortune. The cabin in which Daniel Boone now stood was barely more than a shack, a mockery of what the settlers would have deemed acceptable. His neighbors had taken to calling it a joke ever since he had staked his claim nearly 5 miles out from the small settlement. "Who builds a shelter out of canvas and sticks in this country?" they'd scoffed. The others had quickly thrown up their log cabins, small, hurried affairs with barely enough room to shelter the families they had brought. But Daniel wasn't worried. He had lived a different life before, one shaped by winter's wrath in places far harsher than these plains. The ice-cold winds that now sliced through the land were old friends, ones he'd made peace with long ago in his travels from the highlands to the frontier. As the first storm of the season approached, the prospectors' cabins seemed sturdy enough, built with the basic tools of the land. Yet there was an unease settling over the men who gathered in their warm homes, watching the approaching storm from the safety of their walls. They had no idea how soon they'd need Daniel's ingenuity. He knelt beside the fire in his humble shelter, a stove casting a dim, flickering light against the darkening sky outside. His tent was nothing special, just a piece of tarpaulin stretched over rough poles, but the design was his own. It wasn't the wood or stone that kept the warmth inside, it was the layers. The walls were thick with insulating materials, and the ground had been carefully covered in a thick layer of hay, straw, and cloth. Nothing fancy, but practical. Practicality had saved him many times before. Outside, the howling winds kicked up dust and sand, the telltale signs of a coming storm. But Daniel wasn't frightened. There was a comfort in the storm, a rhythm to it that he had learned to respect. He had been through much worse, after all. With a practiced hand, he stoked the fire and adjusted the stove, which radiated heat with every crackle and hiss. The warmth felt good against his skin, even as the storm began to rage outside. Meanwhile, the neighboring settlers worked feverishly to seal every crack in their cabins, trying to make sure that the walls would hold against the growing cold. They could only hope the firewood they'd gathered was enough, and as night fell, there was little else to do but wait. In Daniel's tent, however, there was an odd quiet that settled over the space, a peace that only someone who had learned to live with the land could truly understand. The storm hit hard and fast. By the time the sun had dipped below the horizon, the sky had darkened to an unyielding gray. The settlers had known it was coming, but no one could have predicted just how quickly the temperature would drop. From within their cabins, they could hear the wind howling, pounding against the wood and shaking the very foundations. The snow fell in thick sheets, muffling all sound, blanketing the world in white. In the distance, Daniel watched the storm from the doorway of his shelter. He could see the lights of the nearby cabins flickering, their flames weak against the overwhelming cold. The storm was relentless, and he knew that soon enough his neighbors would find themselves in trouble. For hours, the storm raged on, and by the early hours of the morning, the temperature had plummeted far below freezing. Daniel's stove kept the warmth inside his shelter, a slow but steady heat that made the cold seem like something that happened outside, far away. But as dawn approached, he knew that the real test was yet to come. The wind was picking up again, the snow now blowing in every direction, covering the land in a thick white sheet. Daniel stepped outside into the storm, feeling the cold sting his face. He had seen worse, of course, but he couldn't help but notice how the other cabins were starting to struggle. The wind had begun to creep in through cracks in the walls, and though the fires inside still burned, they were no match for the searing cold. Back at his shelter, Daniel returned to his warm space, waiting for the inevitable knock. Sure enough, just after the first light of day began to creep over the snow, he heard the faint sound of voices, muffled by the wind. His neighbors, desperate and frightened, had come for refuge. The first man who knocked was the one who had always mocked him the loudest, William Crawford. His breath came in short bursts, his face pale from the cold. "Daniel," he called through the wind. "You were right about your tent. Can we come in?" Daniel opened the door without hesitation. Inside, the warmth that greeted them felt like a balm against the bitter cold that had numbed their limbs. One by one, the other settlers followed Crawford inside, all of them shaking with the cold. As they huddled together in the warmth, the reality of the storm's power settled in. The snow piled high outside the shelter, and the wind continued to howl. But inside Daniel's tent, the heat from the stove radiated out, pushing back against the encroaching cold. It was a warmth that no log cabin could provide in the face of such a storm. For the first time, his neighbors saw the ingenuity in his work. What they had once mocked now stood as a beacon of survival. By the second day of the storm, it was clear to everyone who had sought shelter in Daniel's tent that they were no longer just surviving, they were being saved. The wind outside continued to shriek, but inside there was only the soft crackle of the stove and the low murmur of voices. The men huddled around the fire, their faces drawn and tired, but the warmth in the shelter had begun to feel like a kind of safety they hadn't known they could hope for. The storm had reached its full fury by the third night, and there was no sign of it letting up. The snowdrifts were already waist-deep around the cabins, and many of the settlers had not been able to keep up with the amount of firewood they had stored. The roads to town were blocked, and the trains hadn't come for days. Supplies were running low, and hunger had begun to set in for those who hadn't prepared adequately. But within the warmth of Daniel's tent, there was an unexpected calm. The men had gathered together, the sounds of the storm muffled by the thick walls of the shelter. They spoke little. What was there to say? The fact that they were alive was enough. They were used to hardship, but this winter, this storm, had proven something deeper to them. The land could be unforgiving, but so could the elements. The cold was no respecter of men, and the storm didn't care about their wealth or social standing. Everyone was equal in the face of nature's power. Daniel moved quietly through the shelter, checking on the fire and adding more fuel. He didn't speak much. His silence, in contrast to the nervous chatter of his neighbors, seemed to reassure them. He had been through storms like this before, and his calmness spread like a steady hand over the others. After a while, William Crawford approached him quietly, his voice almost a whisper, as if not wanting to disturb the fragile peace inside the tent. "Daniel," he began, his face drawn with exhaustion, "I've been thinking, we were fools, all of us. We thought your shelter was just a joke, but it saved us." Daniel met his gaze without saying anything. There was no need for words. Crawford's apology, though unspoken in its own way, was a recognition of what had been true all along. The men who had mocked him, who had called him foolish, now realized that it wasn't the size of the shelter or the type of material that mattered. It was the thoughtfulness, the care, and the years of experience behind the decisions. The days began to blur together. Inside the shelter, the warmth was a stark contrast to the cold and isolation outside. It became a place not just of physical shelter, but of solace. As the storm raged on, Daniel kept the fire steady, ensuring that no one went without food or warmth. They were safe here, and as the men shared their stories, some of hardship, some of regret, an unspoken bond began to form between them. This wasn't just about surviving a storm anymore. It was about the recognition that they had all been part of something greater than themselves. They had learned something they could never forget. Survival wasn't just about the physical world. It was about who you were in the face of it. As the days wore on, the storm finally began to lose its fury. The wind softened, and the heavy snow finally slowed. What had started as a terrifying force of nature had become a quiet aftermath, leaving the world outside blanketed in a deep silence. But the damage had been done. The men who had found refuge in Daniel's tent knew that survival had been only part of the battle. The real test was still ahead, the struggle to rebuild and to endure the consequences of what the storm had left in its wake. On the morning of the fourth day, Daniel stepped outside. The air was still and bitterly cold, but the sky had begun to clear. The snow that had piled up around the tents and cabins was now a thick layer of ice, reflecting the pale light of the sun. The landscape had changed completely. It was a barren world, marked by the ravages of nature, where nothing was certain. One by one, the men began to emerge from the shelter. Their clothes were stiff with the cold, their faces lined with exhaustion, But there was something else in their eyes, a quiet recognition. For all their bickering and skepticism, for all their pride and stubbornness, they had made it through. And the man they had called a fool had been the one to show them how. The cabins around them had fared poorly. The wind had found every gap in the walls, every crack in the foundations, and now, with the storm over, the men could see the extent of the damage. The firewood they had thought would last was nearly gone, and the snow had seeped into the walls, making the air inside frigid. "Looks like you were right after all," William Crawford said, looking at the damage around him. He had come to the shelter with a scowl, but now he stood there, humbled. His eyes flickered to Daniel, and he gave a silent nod of respect. "We couldn't have made it through without you." Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. The others knew by now that he wasn't one for words. He had proven his worth, and there was nothing else to say. The settlers set to work, clearing the snow, and attempting to salvage what they could. The air was full of the sharp, brittle sounds of the wind and the shuffling of boots in the snow. But Daniel was already moving. He had no time to waste. There was rebuilding to do, and for him, there was always more work to be done. The storm had long since passed, but the effects lingered like a memory too painful to shake. The land outside, blanketed in snow, looked like a forgotten world, a place where nothing had ever lived. It felt as though everything, the land, the men, and even the very air itself had been tested beyond endurance. But amidst the harsh landscape, Daniel Boone's shelter remained, as solid and steady as the day the storm had first descended. The days that followed were filled with the work of rebuilding, but there was a difference in the way the men approached the task now. They moved with purpose, their actions quiet but filled with determination. The mockery that had once been cast upon Daniel's tent had been replaced with a silent respect, a respect that was earned not through words, but through the simple truth of survival. The settlers who had once laughed at him now followed his lead, rebuilding their cabins with a new understanding of what truly mattered in the face of nature's fury. Daniel didn't stand in the center of it all, offering advice or leading the charge. He didn't need to. He knew what had to be done, and he trusted his neighbors to find their own way, just as he had. The years he had spent in the mountains, the valleys, and the plains had taught him that survival was not just about brute strength. It was about knowing when to listen to the land and when to listen to yourself. The wind and the storms had spoken to him in ways that few could understand, but now they spoke to everyone in the same quiet, inevitable language. William Crawford was the first to approach him, his face weathered by the cold and the hard labor of the past few days. "I never thought I'd see the day," he said, his voice thick with the weight of everything he had learned. "But I see it now. That shelter of yours wasn't a joke, Daniel. It was a life raft. And you, well, you were the one who knew how to build it." Daniel nodded, his gaze turning toward the horizon. The land stretched before them, empty and vast, but not unwelcoming. The sun, weak and pale, hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the snow. There was a quiet peace now, a stillness that only came after surviving something that should have broken them. But here, amid the remnants of the storm, they were still standing, still fighting. As the settlers began to rebuild their cabins, Daniel moved to the edge of the camp and stood alone for a while, staring out across the land. His shelter had stood through the worst storm in years, and now it was a symbol, not just of survival, but of something deeper, of the resilience that lived in the heart of every man who had faced the harsh realities of the frontier. In time, Daniel's shelter became more than just a place to keep warm. It became a symbol of wisdom passed down through hardship, a lesson learned through pain and perseverance. His neighbors began to share their stories with each other, telling tales of how Daniel had saved them, how his tent had been the one thing that had kept them from losing everything. They would remember it for years to come, long after the storm had passed and the land had healed. Daniel Boone's tent stood in the memories of the men who had come to him for refuge, a reminder that sometimes survival wasn't about the biggest cabin or the best supplies. Sometimes it was about knowing what the land needed and building for the worst. No matter how much others laughed or mocked, and long after Daniel had moved on, his name became synonymous with resilience, an echo in the mountains, a whisper in the plains. The lesson he had taught, through action more than words, would endure for generations. The storm had passed, but its lessons remained.